Hi, this episode of the Comics Alternative, one of the most insightful and intelligent comic podcasts out there, is brought to you in part with the support of Patreon pledges from listeners like me, Sal Good Sam. Patreon is a crowdfunding platform that helps content providers generate some income for content they often give away for free, like this show. As a comic artist, I use it myself. It's been a huge help in making ends meet, and I'm super pleased to be able to pass some of that on via my own pledges to a number of other creators like Derek and Andy, so they too can enrich our cultural landscape. Become a patron of the arts and letters. Pledge today at patreon.com/comicsalternative.
This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Dara Naraghi and Brent Bowman. Hello and welcome to the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, one of the two guys with PhDs talking about comics. And on this interview show, I have the pleasure of talking with Dara Naraghi and Brent Bowman. They are the creators behind the series Persia Blues, the second volume of which came out just last month. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price, sometimes you'll find them at 50% off of the cover price, but often you can find discounts that go higher from there. And one of the things you can always count on at Discount Comic Book Service is bundles. They have great discounts on bundled comics, and this month, in January, you can find a variety of bundles from such publishers as DC, Marvel, Vertigo, part of DC, and Valiant, and there are many more specials there as well. You have to go to the website and find out what they are for this month. So go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. And as you're waiting to hear back from the people at Discount Comic Book Service, go ahead and brew yourself a nice cup of coffee. And where can you get your coffee? Why, at Just Coffee Co-op. That's right, they have 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified coffee. Everything is roasted in small batches, no mass production, it's roasted to order. They were founded in 2001 with a roastery in Madison, Wisconsin. It's a great place to get your coffee, tea, and chocolates. Just go to their website, justcoffee.coop, and when you check out, be sure to use the coupon code COMICS. That'll give you 10% off of your order, and shipping is also free. So go to justcoffee.coop, and when you check out, use our coupon code COMICS for 10% off of your order. It's a great way to get caffeinated. Back in summer of 2013, I wrote a review of Volume 1 of Persia Blues for the Comics Alternative blog, and at the time I noted that this was the first in what is projected to be a trilogy. Well, the second volume in that trilogy was published just last month, and instead of writing another review, I decided to have the creators of Persia Blues, Dara Naraghi and Brent Bowman, on the show to talk about the book themselves. So we have a great conversation, and I hope you'll enjoy listening to the interview and find out what all went into the creation of the series Persia Blues. I'm pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Dara Naraghi and Brent Bowman. They are the creators behind Persia Blues. Volume 2 just came out in December from NBM. Guys, how are you doing today?
Great.
Yep, doing good.
And for those listeners who may not be familiar with your series, Persia Blues, can you quickly encapsulate what the story is about?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. So this is Dara. And this is actually one of the hardest things that I've had to do when I was pitching the story, because it's kind of weird and convoluted. But basically, it is a story of a young Iranian woman living in Iran, who is looking to go, pursue her graduate studies. She's trying to come to the U.S. for that. And so we follow her life, sort of a slice of life story, and the daily struggles that she has, and family issues, and, all that kind of good family drama. And then at the same time, we have a parallel story with her in ancient Persia, having these grand adventures, and there is ancient Persian mythology and religion and all of that intertwined with it. And
sword fights and demons and monsters.
Yeah. And so then one of the central sort of mysteries of the book is, how do these two settings relate to each other? How is she in both? Which one is real? Which one isn't? Are they both real? Is neither one real? So that's sort of like the bigger mystery of the book.
In fact, I probably shouldn't have said quickly encapsulate what they were back, because I should have remembered that, because if you remember back in summer of 2013 when Volume 1 came out, I did a review of that for the blog, and I can empathize when you said, it's kind of a convoluted plot. I had to write the review in that way, talking about these two storylines. And, when you read the book, I think it seems much more straightforward than when you attempt to write about it or represent it either on a blog or in a podcast. Now, those two storylines you've titled Here and There, where the Here stories is the one that takes place in Persia, and the There is the one that takes place in more contemporary times. Now, by the time we get to the second volume, I think a lot that wasn't as clear in Volume 1 is cleared up a little bit in Volume 2, but not everything. And one of the things that's not clear yet for me as a reader is the distinction of the here or there, or I guess a better way of putting that is why you're calling one timeline here and the other one there. Anything you can tell us that won't give anything away in the third volume?
Not a lot, other than in the third volume when, everything is revealed. I think it'll make sense then why one is called here and the other one is there.
Okay. I assumed that things would be wrapped up in this third volume in terms of the timeline distinctions. And this is a trilogy, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. So now, if the first volume came out in 2013, the second volume came out just last month, when can we expect Volume 3?
Well, we're going to shoot for either the end of this year, 2016, or very early in 2017. The second volume got delayed a lot longer than I wanted to, and it was mainly my fault. I had a hard time getting into getting the script done due to various other reasons, and Brent was patiently and eagerly waiting for me to get it done. So I think hopefully for this third volume it won't be as long of a wait.
I think it paid off, though, because I think the second volume, I think the first volume was great, but I think the second volume was even better. Both story and art-wise. I know my artwork, just constantly working on it really improved my skills as an artist.
You think because of the longer incubation period?
Well, not necessarily that, just a little bit of that, just more along the lines of the first volume really got me, I'm trying to think of how to explain it. It was more
spending time
with the characters, and and then I did have a lot of time between the first and second volume to kind of take a break and not get so attached to it. So when I started back over again, it was much fresher, and it was kind of like sorry to change the subject a little bit. Dara's actually he only sends me a few pages at a time, a few scenes at a time. So it really keeps me emotionally attached to the story because I don't know what's going to happen to the characters next, and I kind of created the look and the feel of the characters. So, I'm really surprised when something good or bad happens to one of them. And I think that really helps me as an artist because it makes me really attuned to those characters, almost like they're real people in my life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and in fact, I was going to ask you about the dynamic that the two of you have in working on the Persia Blues series. So you're saying, Brent, that when you are illustrating the narrative, you have a couple of pages, but only 2 or 3 pages, and then you work with that. So
actually about 10 or so.
Oh, okay. So, but you don't know how things will ultimately play out, and you're illustrating with what you know.
With what I know, yeah. I mean, Dara's gave me a very brief synopsis of what's going to happen, but yeah, I have no idea, I have no idea what's going to happen from one scene to the next, and when it's going to happen. For example, I don't want to give anything away, but if something really bad is going to happen to a character, I'll kind of know that it's coming, but then when I actually get the scene, it's kind of a surprise because I didn't expect it at that point or whatever. So this might sound really cheesy, but in the first volume, there was a character that passed away, and when I started to draw it, I actually teared up a little bit. Just because, and I knew it was going to happen. As soon as I started drawing that character after they were gone, it just made me feel almost like it was my own family member, somebody I knew that had passed away. It was kind of weird. And I think it's entirely because I don't really know exactly what's going to happen next, but I still feel really attached to these characters.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the art, or a little more about the art. One of the things that distinguishes the two storylines, one from the other, the here and then the there, is the style of art. And how, and this is an audio podcast. We'll put up examples of images in the show notes. But how would you describe the differences in the style between the storylines?
Well, the real world setting, that's the there, right? Mm-hmm. There is more traditional comic book style, just black ink on white paper. I don't use a lot of cross hatching. I kind of prefer much more of a black and white feel, line work with some shade, black spotting. Mm-hmm. And the here segments are, I use ink wash, gray tone markers, graphite, and even sometimes charcoal to get kind of a layered effect. I use for the organic textures like rocks or skin, trees, I use a lot more pencil. And then when I get into clothing and fabric, I tend to use more markers. And then kind of a combination of both. So that was Dara's idea originally, was to have the two segments done in different styles.
Yeah, and I sort of thought, since we do jump back and forth constantly between the two settings, I wanted there to be a visual designation to it, as well as obviously with the story you can tell what setting it is, but I thought visually it'd be nice to separate the two as well. And then the other great thing is, even though they're drawn in different styles, since it's Brent drawing the whole thing, it's still very cohesive, and it's obviously his style. It's just, you get a different feel for each. And one is a lot more, like he was saying, textured and layered, and the other one is more of a clean line and a simplified style.
Yeah, I make a concerted effort when I'm doing my penciling to make sure that everything looks the same. So if you were to lay out the pencils for each different segment, it's all going to look the same. The only difference is the technique on top. So I tried to do that to keep it more cohesive, but still be different.
Yeah, you can tell that it's the same artist, and I do appreciate the fact that the styles are distinctively different. And, Dara, as you mentioned, you can tell the here from the there in terms of setting, clothing, and whatnot. But it is helpful when you're reading through the text, and especially afterwards when you're thumbing back and forth trying to, let's say, write about it, a review on a blog, or to prepare for a podcast, to see the two different styles, because those are easy keys as to what storyline you're in. So I think that works really well.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, and I should also mention that their storyline is complex in its own way, in that, unlike the Here storyline, which takes place in Persia, I guess the more fantastical part of the series, in the There with Minu, and is that how you pronounce her name? Minu?
Yep.
Yes. The protagonist. When we're in her life in more contemporary times, it's not a straight chronological narrative. I mean, you're going back and forth. We see her in the here and now. At other times, we're back 12 or 14 years ago when she was a little girl. At other times, we fast forward to where she's a teenager or a young adult. And so it goes back and forth. So even within their storyline, you do play around with time.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've always loved doing in stories, and I think it works especially well in comics because it's really easy. You can, if you want to help the reader just a little bit, you can start those segments with, 10 years ago or 12 years ago or whatever. But it does give you more flexibility in the tools you have for that story, and I thought it would be fun for their segments, the modern Iran segments, to kind of jump back and forth and slowly reveal, bits and pieces about her life and her relationship with her family members, and drop some hints, and then later on, you either as a flashback, to an earlier part of her life, or even going more forward to the more present time. Then you pick up what that hint was, or you understand what happened and why, she feels a certain way about someone. And I was a little concerned that maybe it's a little too much. Maybe, we're asking a little too much of the reader and it's going to just be confusing. But, from what I've heard and the feedback we've gotten from the reviews that we've seen, I don't think anyone's had a problem with it. So I think it's worked out.
Yeah, I found it fairly straightforward to follow, even though you're jumping around in time. I mean, there's some narratives, comics and otherwise, where you're jumping around in time, and it's confusing, intentionally or maybe not so intentionally. But I think that even with the shifting in time with their storyline, you more or less know pretty much where you are in the story.
Yeah, and honestly, if anyone was having a hard time with it, it was me as I was writing it. Mm-hmm. So, I have my little notebook where I jotted down all the original ideas for the story, and I was developing it because I'm very much sort of visual and tactile person. Like, I got to write stuff down, and that's how I keep track of it and organize my thoughts. But in my notebook, one of the pages is actually a timeline, and I've got, all the years marked off and what age she was in at each one of those years. So when I'm jumping back and forth and I'm saying, 14 years ago or 2 years ago, I know how old she was, what was happening in her life, who was alive, who wasn't, just so I could keep it all straight, because I want it to be cohesive, and I want it to make sense, and I want, if somebody goes back and rereads all of them, or at some point in the future, hopefully we'll have a collected edition of the entire trilogy, is for it all to make sense. I don't want people to be like, oh, wait a minute.
So there are plans for, after the third volume comes out, to eventually collect all three into one volume?
I hope so. I mean, I would like to, and I briefly mentioned it with NBM, and they're interested, but we'll have to wait and see.
Well, let's talk about the premise of the story and also where it actually came from. So how did this idea of Persia Blues germinate?
It probably percolated for a while in my mind. It all came about when I first got into comics, more in a professional capacity, and I was doing a lot of, work for hire. I was doing a lot of licensed properties, mostly for IDW. And it was a lot of fun. Like, I was having a total blast. But at the end of the day, none of those were stories that I owned or characters that I owned, and I always knew that I wanted to do something creator-owned and make it kind of big. So it all kind of just over the years slowly came together. And I honestly can't say like where the germ of the idea came from. But I knew very early on I wanted to have a female protagonist. I knew I wanted to do something where I could bring in my Iranian background, and Persian culture, and portray it in a positive way. Because for the most part, whenever, at least in either news or even in popular media, when we hear about Iran, it's usually in some kind of negative light, or it's about the politics that's going on.
It's a Chuck Norris movie.
Yeah. So I wanted to, I didn't want to shy away from. Yeah, there's a lot of problems and the actual issues, but I wanted to portray it in general in a positive light, and I wanted to show stuff about the culture that maybe we don't see too often in the West, and I wanted to spotlight the mythology and the Zoroastrian religion and all of these things that came out of ancient Persia. So all of that stuff just kept kind of tumbling around in the back of my head, and eventually I came up with the thread that tied it all together. And another aspect of it too was I was kind of waffling back and forth between, do I want to do a straight up sort of a slice of life, very contemporary story, or do I want to concentrate more on the mythical and cultural aspects of it? And that's sort of what somehow I came up with the idea of, I could do them both, and I can combine them, and that's how I came up with that idea of how to combine the two and tell these two separate but related stories.
What was the heavy Zoroastrian context of this story already there inside of you, or is this something you had to do a little more research into?
I definitely had to do a lot of research on it. At a very basic level, I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't know, obviously all the details. And then the more I read and the more I researched it, the more I really liked the idea of wanting to incorporate some of those texts from the teachings, because I thought, not only does it fit the ancient Persia setting really well, but just the way that language comes off when you read it, it just, I don't know, there's something about it that I really liked, and I was trying to figure out how best to incorporate it. And I did more of that in the second book than in the first book, but I think it made sense. Like in the first book, there's like a couple little areas here and there, but in the second book, since there's this huge battle scene, it sort of made sense to talk about some of these bigger themes of life and death and right versus wrong in the context of that.
And we see these characters in Volume 1, but I think they play a more prominent role in this second volume, which is titled Love and War. The figures of, and correct me if I'm mispronouncing these names, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, and one is the supreme creator, and then the other is what described as the destructive spirit.
Yeah, essentially, it's the Western concept of God and the devil arrived from Zoroastrianism. I mean, Mazda is the creator god, and Ahriman is the evil spirit. Am I?
Yeah, no, that's pretty true. And a lot of scholars will say that Zoroastrian religion was the first monotheistic religion, whereas prior to that, it was more of a pagan and multiple deities. And in that religion, Ahura Mazda, the creator, there's just one creator. He is the one sole creator. He is the source of light and good and wisdom in the world. And Ahriman is not another god. It's not like another god in this pantheon of deities that they have fights with. He is just the embodiment of the spirit of destruction and darkness.
That was something I found really interesting when I was doing the artwork, and just in general, just concept wise. Is in Zoroastrianism, the Western religions, fire is evil. Fire, the devil always lives in fire. The demons are always surrounded by fire. And in Zoroastrianism, fire is actually good. Ahura Mazda is represented by flames because flames bring light into the darkness. So the darkness is evil, encompassing everything, kind of like in Neverending Story. And then light is bright, and it creates hope and peace. And so that was kind of interesting. So normally all the demons would be surrounded by fire and flames, but in this one, actually, the demons are surrounded by darkness.
Yeah.
Now let me ask you, why the choice to write from the perspective of a female protagonist? Again, our protagonist is Minu Shazari, and she's the protagonist in both of the storylines, the here and the there. Why the decision, and what potential, let's say, hurdles have you guys felt in representing the female voice here?
Well, I'll answer the second part of your question first. So, I mean, the biggest hurdle is, I'm not a woman, but I'm writing a female character. So there is some inherent, I don't know if I'd necessarily say struggle, but, some challenge there because, how do I try to capture this voice and make it sound authentic when I'm a guy? Honestly, I don't think that it was a big problem, or at least I didn't struggle with it, and hopefully it doesn't come across, stilted or whatever as readers are reading it, because what I was more interested in was creating an interesting character who has some really great qualities, but also has some flaws, like all of us humans, and then show why maybe she has some of those traits that we may not necessarily think are strengths, and then how she grows, literally as that character grows, because we see her at different stages of her life. I wanted to show, how she matures and how she meets some of those challenges herself. So that was maybe so like I said, the second part of your question. The first part of your question, why a female protagonist, that was another thing very early on I decided I definitely wanted to do. And I think I mentioned this maybe in a interview for the first book. There's a lot of, from a storytelling perspective, there's a lot of great potential with a female character in the modern Iranian setting, because, that country right now is under rule of a theocracy, of an Islamic government. And so there are a lot more barriers for women in terms of what they can do and what they can say and how they can dress that there aren't necessarily for men. So there's a lot more, I feel like there's a lot more potential for drama and for, interaction of that character with her environment and surroundings, and it makes it for a richer story. But then just in general, I think our natural inclination maybe as creators is usually to create a character that's the most like us because we know ourselves the best. And so it would have been easier for me to just, write a male character, or maybe even a male character who comes to the U.S. at a young age the way that I did, because then I could totally draw upon all of those experiences I had myself firsthand, and put it in the story. But I sort of thought like, that might be a little bit like taking the easy way out, and I didn't necessarily want to do it. And I'm babbling on, but one more thing I'll mention about that is I have a daughter as well, so I also wanted to have a character where I can express some of her points of view, some of her ideals and her struggles and her thoughts and whatever. And hopefully make that character more real, because, here's someone that I'm very close to and very familiar with, and I've seen her grow up, so I can draw upon some of those things and imbue it in the character.
Yeah, in reading back through Volume 1 and then the most recent volume that came out last month, it struck me that had you written this from the perspective of a male voice who, would be about the same age as Manu, it would be completely different, I guess, in both storylines, but especially in the more contemporary There storyline, because there's just so much more potential for conflict and even growth given the context of the theocratic government we currently have in Iran. And I went back through the very first bit that we have with Manu in the There storyline, becomes a conflict with the moral police. She's saving a friend or trying to help out a woman that she just met who's being harassed by the morality police for not wearing her hijab correctly.
Right.
And then this stuff comes up several times throughout the two volumes, in terms of the way that she presents herself or the way that women are supposed to present themselves. And this even bleeds into her relationship with her father, Bijan. Now, Bijan, we should mention to our listeners, is, I guess you would call, he's a scholar, he's a professor, he is quite liberal. But I find it interesting that Minu's relationship with her father is in some way, and tell me if I'm completely off base here, almost a stand-in for her or women's relationship with the theocratic government in Iran. Not that they're the same thing, but that there are some interesting semi-parallels that are going on between those two dynamics.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I wasn't necessarily trying to bring that out so much, but I think it's true because, you have, honestly, even in Western countries, so much of the power in terms of who, is in the ruling class or who's making up the laws and stuff, it tends to skew way more towards male than female. So there's always that sort of inherent bias. And then the other thing with her relationship with her father that I was interested in was, we typically, I think, we'll see more the stereotype of, a Middle Eastern man or a Muslim man being very strict and being very conservative. And that's not what I wanted to portray in her father. I wanted to show someone who is actually fairly liberal, who is, like you said, a scholar. He's a history professor, who is very idealistic, who does not, agree with the way that the country is run and with the government. But despite all of that, he's a father and he has a daughter, and there's still that dynamic, and
well, he's very stubborn.
Yes.
He's very stubborn, and he's very, everything has to be his way. So in some ways it does kind of, you've got the government and, he's trying to protect her, but, he's a little overbearing.
Yeah.
As a father, I actually am completely sympathetic with Bijan. And I keep wondering how the viewers, like an older reader is going to relate more, I think, to Bijan, whereas a younger reader is going to relate more to Minu. I was just thinking about that the other day when I was reading it. I'm like, I know Dara said that he was supposed to be kind of overbearing, but I kind of like, if I have boys, but if I had a girl, I might react some of that same way. So I just thought that was an interesting idea.
Yeah.
And you were mentioning the the father Bijan. I think with the entire Shirazi family, if you take them out of the context of contemporary Iran, they could be and put them into a U.S. setting. They could be like almost any other family one would write about. So they're definitely not what maybe some may think of stereotypical Iranians, because but how do I put this in the current political climate that we're in? There are a number of Americans who do have these stereotypes of first off Muslims in general,
right,
but Iranians in particular. But what you've done is to give us what I would call a typical middle-class family, or what would be a typical middle-class family in the United States, but you've put them in the context of current-day Iran, and that adds a series of complications that you wouldn't have in a U.S. setting. So, this is a very identifiable family to me.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because that was one of the things I was striving for. When I was first working on the outline and just the characters and coming up with those ideas, I think it skewed a lot more towards more of a traditional Iranian family. And honestly, I got to a point where, like, myself as the writer was like, honestly, I don't really like or can relate to these characters that much. And if I can't do it, I'm sure that the readers won't. So I wanted it to be a lot of the more universal themes, obviously, that folks can relate to. And like you were saying, this is a family where if they were living here, they would have a lot of these same issues and a lot of the interactions and a lot of the conflicts, because those are universal. That's the nature of family. That's the nature of fathers and daughters, or of siblings or whatever. So yeah, I want readers who may not know anything about Iranian culture to still understand and be able to empathize or sympathize with the characters and to see, sort of both points of view. And like Brent was saying, I hadn't really thought about that because, I see Manu as the focal point. But obviously there are reasons why her father wants to do certain things or wants her not to do certain things. And there's valid reasons behind them. Now, whether she agrees or not is part of what drives that conflict, and that's her choice. But yeah, I didn't want to make like, oh, well, here's this overbearing, terrible, evil father, and then here's this innocent daughter who's just trying to be free. It's a lot more complicated because life is a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, and you were talking about the complications of family dynamics. And we learned this fairly early on, I think even in the first volume, that the relationship between Bijan and his wife, Menige, is that how you pronounce her name?
Yeah.
It's not that rosy.
Right.
It has its complications.
Yeah, it has its complications, and it affects, their children, just the same way as, those kinds of relationships here or anywhere in the world would.
Mm-hmm. And, we've been talking about the relationship between Manu and Bijan, daughter and father, but we haven't talked much about the relationship between mother and daughter. So we've talked about, did I get that correct? Between daughter and father, but not between daughter and mother. Right. And this is something that is slowly playing out between the two volumes. By the end of volume 1, we find out that the relationship between Manu and her mother in the contemporary storyline comes to a head in the more fantastical, mythological storyline here. And then we find out more about that relationship in Volume 2. But in that here storyline, the father is curiously absent, although he's alluded to in both volumes. And so I'm just assuming as a reader that reveal of the father in the here storyline will become apparent in Volume 3.
Yes, absolutely.
Answer a lot of questions.
Yep. And there's a reason why we don't see him in that storyline. And again, hopefully, by the time Volume 3 is out and the story is done, it'll make sense why.
That reminds me, one of the things I really enjoy about the here storyline in both of the volumes that are out is that every now and again, Manu will do something or say something that is out of context. For instance, I think it's in Volume 1 that she mentions something about Columbus, about where they're from, or maybe it's in Volume 2. I can't remember.
It's Volume 1. It's right at the end, I think.
Right, when they get to Persepolis. And she mentions that when the Empress, who she finds out is her mother, when the Empress asks her, where do you come from, she says Columbus. And why did I say that? And what does that mean? And there are little things like that happen, and it reminds me of a computer program that has a little glitch in it, and you don't know what that little glitch is.
Well, in Volume 1, the opening scene, the Persian background is actually the Columbus skyline, as though it was conceived by the ancient Persians. I did that on purpose. So if you hold that up to the Columbus skyline, the shape matches. And then there's a scene where they're at the Horseshoe, the Ohio State University football field, and I made it look like a Persian amphitheater type of thing. So it's early on, it's sort of an amalgam of Columbus and ancient Persia.
Yeah, and obviously, it's all done intentionally, and the reason for Columbus, maybe for readers who haven't read the books yet or aren't familiar, one of the settings in the book is Columbus, Ohio, because not much of a spoiler, but she does manage to get into a university in the U.S. and come to the U.S. to study, and she comes to the Ohio State University, which is in Columbus, Ohio, which is where both of us are from. And that was another, again, an intentional thing because I wanted to, obviously you can have her go anywhere in the U.S., but I wanted to do maybe more of a unusual or unexpected setting. No one ever thinks about Columbus, Ohio as a setting. But we're familiar with the city, so we could, both in terms of the writing and the art, hopefully make it seem more real because we've lived here and we've experienced it. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, and plus if you had Manu go to Harvard or Berkeley, I would have thought, okay, cliche. So why not place her in a place that makes sense? It's a great school, but readers may not normally think of that. Plus, it. You know the area.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, honestly, from more of a personal perspective, both of my parents went to OSU, and, this was in early 60s. So, and they sort of experienced what Minu was experiencing in that they came from Iran to the U.S., where they had this vague notion of what the U.S. is, but they had no clue in the world, what the heck or where the heck Columbus, Ohio is. But that's where they happened to be accepted, so they came to study. And it was like this big, obviously for them much more so than Minu, it was this big culture shock of adjusting and it at the time not being such a big metropolitan, city and all that kind of stuff. Now in Minu's case, she lives in the internet age, so it's not like any of this stuff is totally foreign to her. And she, even in the story, we talk about how her father had made sure that she takes English lessons, so she's, she can speak it and read it and write it and all that stuff. But yeah, it was like I wanted to bring in little bits and pieces of my experience, my parents, my family's experience, and just kind of pepper them in with the story to both make it more fun for me personally as I'm writing it, but also, hopefully add a little bit of realism to it.
Yeah, and in fact, toward the end of Volume 1, when she realizes that, when her father tells her that she's been accepted to OSU, and she goes onto the computer, her father asks her, are you looking up the architecture department there? And she says, nope, I'm going to Google Maps just to find out where Columbus actually is.
Right, yeah.
Well, getting back to, Brent, what you had said about the opening art in Volume 1, that it resembles the Persian landscape in those panels resemble the skyline of Columbus, of OSU. I didn't realize that because I'm not familiar with that context. But that reminded me of something that I thought was just a phenomenal thing that you did with the art, and also as a way to very cohesively but subtly bring the two storylines, the here and the there, together in Volume 2. And I'm looking on page 93, and this is the more contemporary their storyline. This is when Manu and her brother go to visit their mother, who's in the hospital. She has cancer. And then right after that, beginning on page 101, you have the here storyline, which takes place in Persia, where Manu is going in to see the Empress, who's been inflicted with poison. The panel layout between those two sections, when I first read this, I didn't catch it, but then in going back through, I thought, hey, wait a minute now, that composition looks familiar. And then I did a panel-by-panel comparison between those two sections, and I thought, damn, that's a great way of bringing these two storylines together, even more cohesively.
There's actually I don't know if you noticed the other. There's another example of that too. There's the I don't want to give anything away to readers that haven't seen it, but there's a scene from the soccer match a little earlier that also exactly parallels the scene from the big battle just a few pages later.
I did notice similar dynamics going on, or at least thematically. The link between the battle in Persia or in Persepolis and the soccer match, but I don't think I did a panel-to-panel comparison, so I'll have to check that out as well.
Yeah, that was in the script. That was something Dara scripted intentionally. but it was a lot of fun to draw. I mean, I got to, especially with the battle scene, to try and make a soccer match into a battle.
Yeah.
But yeah, with the scene with the mother, that was also intentional, and I tried to vary it a little bit, but yeah, it was definitely an intentional thing.
That's one of those fun things as a writer where I can script it, and I'll say to Brent that when you're drawing this particular page showing the soccer match, keep in mind that we're going to sort of parallel this layout later on when we have the battle scene, and then when he's drawing the battle scene, I'll in the script I'll refer him back to the page with the soccer match. But it's great because for me it's really easy to write. I'll just say these two things should parallel each other, and the panel should be kind of the same. And that's the easy part, and then Brent has to do the really hard part of figuring out how the heck to stage that. But
it's really fun for me. That's what I love doing. I love all the little details that nobody will ever notice. I love that stuff. And I put things in there. I actually had Dara made me redraw it, but I actually had I had a "Where's Waldo" moment. I actually hid Waldo in one of the battle scenes, but
you hid Waldo.
I removed it. It's not in the final book, but on my original artwork, I actually included Waldo in the background. But Dara was right; it was probably a little distracting, but it was just kind of funny. But I do lots of little things, like in Manu's bedroom in the first volume. I did a whole bunch of research, and I looked up what toys would be available in Iran in, 90, whatever year it was.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't figure it out.
I learned that Barbie dolls were not banned in Iran until the 2000s, or the late 90s. So Manu would have had Barbie dolls in her room. So I made sure to include some Barbie dolls in there. And I looked up Iranian toys. I researched Iranian toys. So everything in her room, I'm quite proud of the fact everything in her room would have been in her room at that particular time. And nobody will ever notice that. Nobody will ever, those are little tiny things, but to me, that's one of my favorite things to draw. It's just the little tiny things. I have a lot of my own personal, there's a bookshelf in their house that keeps moving around from room to room throughout the years. That is totally a bookshelf that I've had since I was a kid.
Huh.
So lots of little things like that are really fun for me to draw.
So I think at one point she had a Green Day poster in her room.
Yes.
And then at another point when she was a teenager, she's wearing a Ramones T-shirt.
Yeah.
So you made sure that someone from that time, that age, could have those things in their room or be wearing those kind of T-shirts.
Yes. Yeah, between me and Dara, we did. We were accurate. Yeah, the only one that I had to make up, Dara specified she's wearing a heavy metal T-shirt in one scene, and I could not find any tons of Iranian heavy metal bands, but I couldn't find anything from that actual time period, so I just totally made one up. But, there are tons of Iranian heavy metal bands. They're really popular, but I just couldn't find one from... all the ones I found were a few years after that scene, so...
Well, getting back to the panel parallels that we were discussing in Volume 2, and maybe this gets back to something that you were mentioning earlier, Brent, when you were describing your feeling about the difference working on Volume 2 than from working on Volume 1, that you felt that this was a stronger work. In going through, I am noticing these visual links and parallels between the two storylines in ways that I didn't in the first volume. Now, is this a function of the fact that there is more of those visual links in Volume 2, or is it that I'm just not as observant with the first volume as I have been with the second?
No, you're totally right. It was more it's more of the storyline in Volume 2. I think correct me if I'm wrong, Dar, because you're the writer, but I was kind of getting the feeling that the first one is definitely setting up the mystery, so it's a lot more opaque. It's a lot harder to kind of guess what's going on. And then in the second volume, we're definitely opening up the mystery and giving you a lot more hints. And then I'm assuming by the third one, it's going to be much more open. Yeah. I don't know if we're going for a big surprise at the end, or if it's going to be kind of a gradual thing. But.
Yeah, absolutely. It like Brent said, there is some stuff in the first volume, but it's either really, really subtle or it's not. You may not even pick it up, but hopefully if you ever go back and after you read the third volume, you go back and reread the whole thing, then maybe you'll notice it. But yeah, in the second volume, it's a lot more deliberate, especially with like the panel layouts between the two settings and all that. And then, yeah, and the third one will be even more so until the actual explanation, I guess, or reveal, whatever you want to call it.
Well, you guys have talked, you've alluded to a number of times the way that you work together. And we should mention for our listeners that as we're recording this, both of you are in the same room, so you're speaking on the same microphone, and you live right near each other. Does that help facilitate the creative process?
I think so.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really nice because from, the early stages where you're just doing, sketches and character designs and just trying to even come up with the look at the characters and putting together the pitch packet and all that stuff, it is really nice that we could get together either at my house or Brent's, or sometimes we just meet at a library and then, go through stuff and look at it together. And it just makes the collaboration so much easier.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, most of my work I've done with people that I'm close to, that I live close to. So I haven't really done a lot of work, through the emails and through the, internet. Mostly, that's just luck, I guess, on my part. But yeah, definitely, I think it helps that. Well, we've known each other for a while. This was our first project, our first real project working together. Dara was one of the founders of a group called Panel. It's a local writers artist collective that we're on a little hiatus right now, but we put out 2 anthologies a year, and some of the members are writers, some are artists, some are writers and artists, and every anthology would have a theme, and you'd always get to work with different people. But Dara and I had actually only worked together once. Actually, no, it was Dara's daughter, actually. Yeah. So Dara and I hadn't actually worked together. And I always really wanted to work with Dara. So I was really excited when, Persia Blues came up.
So that's how you guys met, the Panel Collective?
Yes.
Yep, yeah. And it worked out really well. Like Brent said, it's funny because it would just kind of naturally shake out, every time we were working on one of these anthologies, somebody would have a script, and then, whichever artist seemed interested in it would just pick it up. And so we would all, we've all, I think almost every person has worked with another person, except like Brent and I never actually worked on a story together. My daughter, when she was younger, wrote this story about our dog that we adopted from the shelter and like how he came to be at the shelter, and Brent drew it and I lettered it. But that's like the closest we came to collaborating together prior to this.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, I really like the way I work with Dara. Working with so many different writers in the collective was really interesting, like all the different styles. Some writers are super particular and they give you exact layouts and it has to be everything, and which is cool because then I like that too, because you can concentrate on the technique. You don't have to worry about figuring out layouts and doing that. I had one friend that liked to work old school Marvel style. He would just send me a plot synopsis, and then I'd do all the artwork, and then he'd go back and plot it and put the dialogue in. One girl I worked with, she was great. She didn't do page layouts. She didn't write by the page. She wrote by the panel. So instead of a 4-page story, she'd give me a 32-panel story. But then Dara, so far, we've just been writing, just working a little bit at a time, a scene at a time, which I really like because, I don't get ahead of myself. I can concentrate on each scene, kind of like I'm a director of a movie, sort of.
Yeah, which I should add, I mean, that was sort of a happy accident. Like, I didn't set out to do it that way. I actually set out, what I wanted to do was write the whole script, have it all done, then obviously go back and revise it and all that kind of stuff. But just the way that the timing worked out, when we started the first volume, I was doing other projects as well. And, I work a regular full-time job. So just my time was at a premium, and I always felt like I'm behind because Brent is actually a very fast artist, which amazes me. As much detail and work as he puts into the pages, he can get them done fast. So at some point I decided, okay, he's just going to be waiting forever for me to finish this. So I'm going to give him what I have. And then as he's working on it, I'll work on, I'll try to stay ahead of him and I'll work on each scene at a time. because I had a really good tight synopsis and breakdown for myself, so I knew where it's all going, and I knew almost all of the scenes. It was just a matter of getting down and getting it on paper and working through the dialogue and all that stuff. But yeah, I didn't mean for it to work out that way, but it did, and it worked out really well.
Yeah, I really like it. Like I said before, I feel it keeps me, like, if I had a whole script, honestly, what I'm going to do is go ahead and look for it and draw all the really fun pages first. That's just what I would do. And this way, like I said, I feel really emotionally connected to the characters, and I feel like it makes my art stronger because I have more of a vested interest in what's going to happen to everybody. And, it would be, there are scenes that it would have been fun to go and draw first, but I think it works out really well this way.
Well, in terms of the writing process, have there been times that, let's say, Dara, you have handed part of a script to Brent, and then in the act of illustrating the story, either Brent or maybe even Dara, when you guys were having a conversation, decide to change things a bit? In other words, does the story become a little more plastic in the transition from script to illustration?
Maybe a little
bit here and there. I would say where there was more of that was actually from finished art to lettering. Because I'm actually lettering the story myself, which I both love and I hate. I hate it because I'm not a fast letterer, and I'm not a letterer. I just taught myself how to do it, and I think I do a good enough job that it looks good. But I would never say that like that's something I excel at. But I love it because honestly, a lot of my rewrites I'll do during the lettering phase because I can see the art, and then some things that in my mind when I was writing the script sounded great or looked great doesn't quite work, or Brent portrayed it a different way, and I think of a better way now to match the dialogue or whatever it is up against it. So in that respect, it's kind of nice, and that helps that we both live close to each other, and B, we're working on a graphic novel where we have a long period of time to finish the whole thing, as opposed to a monthly comic that's got a crazy deadline and you can't really waste your time going back and forth.
Now, you mentioned meeting at the collective panel, and I think, Brent, a second ago you mentioned something about it being on hiatus.
It is. We're actually having a meeting tomorrow night, though. First one in a long time, but
yeah, it's a panel reunion.
It's kind of a reunion meeting, but I don't think that panel's gone for good. I just think, especially when you get older, because we were all a lot younger when we started it.
Yeah, we're in our 30s when we started it.
Panel was, I think my first one was 2006, maybe. Has it been that long?
Yeah, it's I want to say the group has been around like 12 years, maybe longer. So yeah, it sort of became, like Brent was saying, we got older and everybody got busy,
Yeah, I mean, your kids get older and it's, it's harder to get out of the house, and everybody always joked that I was the first one done, which was usually true, but and they said eventually it's going to be an all Brent issue, which wasn't true because everybody got stuff done. But it gets harder and harder to get your stuff done for something that's just mostly just for fun. I mean, they're really awesome, and we always sold them really well at the conventions, but then the money just goes back into the pot to pay for the next issue. So it wasn't like it was a moneymaker or anything. It was just for fun. And, but they're really awesome, and I'm really kind of excited to get back into it.
Yeah.
So we could see more panel anthologies in the months to come.
In the years to come.
In the year, okay.
Because, yeah, like I said, everybody's kind of gone into their own thing. And, but I think I have high hopes for P&L.
Yeah, I do too. So
actually, I already have my story written for the next issue and partially thumbnailed out. So
see what I mean? I mean, he's going to be done by like the meeting tomorrow. Everybody else will be like, I thought we were just getting together for coffee.
Yeah, I like to draw, so yeah, that's what I do for fun.
Well, make sure you tell tomorrow other members of panel about this interview.
Oh, we'll mention it too.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Now, Dara, toward the beginning of our conversation, you had mentioned something about the reviews of Volume 2 of Persia Blues. Not only with the second, but also with the first as well. What kind of reception as a whole has Persia Blues been getting? And specifically, I'm curious what kind of reaction you may be getting from readers in terms of the Iranian subject matter.
Right. I, honestly, it may sound cheesy, but I think for the most part, all the feedback and the reviews have been positive. I didn't know what to expect in terms of the subject matter and whether it would either turn maybe some readers off, or that they just wouldn't care for it. But in all of the reviews that I've read or seen, I think it's actually one of the parts of the book that they call out is that, oh, you know what, a lot of this stuff was new to me and it was interesting to learn about this, or, I didn't know that such, whatever, that this custom existed in Iranian culture or whatever. So that's been super gratifying, and it's really cool to see that. I don't think there's been any kind of negative review, especially about, the setting or the nationality of the characters or whatever. Now, obviously I think a lot of that plays into the fact that it's an indie comic from a very indie graphic novel publisher, NBM. So the kinds of folks that would find this book are probably out looking for books like this. But yeah, it's been really good so far.
So, what about from the Iranian community? Have you gotten any or much reaction from those readers? Perhaps even maybe a little pushback that, oh, you're not representing correctly, or anything of the sort? Right.
That's actually a really good question and a really interesting one. No pushback or anything like that. But I will say, and please, this is totally my personal and biased opinion. I was a little disappointed in how little interest there was in general from the Iranian community, especially in the U.S., I would say. And I did, I went out of my way and I spent an awful lot of time on my own trying to promote and market and get the word out about the book to the Iranian American community. There's a lot of, like Iranian American associations in various big cities. There's a lot of websites and news sites geared towards that community. And, our publisher, NBM, obviously does the rounds with press releases and all that stuff. But I went out on my own and I, sent review copies and previews and all of this stuff and got very, very little interest. So that kind of bugged me, and it still, I don't know, sticks with me a little bit. But of the folks that did comment or review or provide feedback of the Iranians, it was all good. I didn't get any kind of pushback.
Well, why do you think it was that you didn't get any more of a reaction than you did from the Iranian American community?
I honestly don't know.
I wonder if it's bad timing, because there was, we didn't get as much local coverage as I thought we would either.
Yeah, it's been kind of an odd thing. Like I got more local coverage here when I did a Terminator story, and then a story that involves Columbus, Ohio, State University, Iran in general, all this other stuff. But I think a lot of it goes again back to it's sort of a odd and somewhat challenging book and story. It's it's not a very clear cut. It's not an action adventure thing per se. So the audience, I knew, obviously as I was creating it, I knew that it was going to be a smaller audience that would gravitate towards it and enjoy it and get it. But yeah, I don't know. I'm still kind of mystified, a little. Yeah, mystified, I guess, is a good way of putting it.
Well, what Dara said about subject matter, I think holds true. I whenever I tell people I draw comics, the very first thing they say is, "Oh, what superpower does your character have?" And I love superhero comics. I'm not dissing them at all, but that's not what I do. So it's kind of hard for me to answer. Well, I'm doing a family drama about an Iranian girl who in her part-time, fantasy world fights monsters and demons. Or, the project I'm working on a different project right now with another local author. It's okay if I go off my tangent.
Oh, yeah.
So it's really kind of funny because the what really drew me to Persia Blues was the monsters and the sword fights and the, demons and fantasy art. And now somehow I've become known as the go-to guy for, young ethnic girls in trouble, family dramas. So this current book I'm working on is about a Somali girl, a 14-year-old Somali girl that's just come to the U.S. and her father's put her in private school. And it's entirely family drama. There's no fantasy element to that at all. But that's just I kind of lost my train of thought there. But
how one led to the other.
Yeah, it's just I just kind of suddenly gotten these other offers for primarily family drama, teenage soap opera type of things, which is awesome. This other book, it's called, I'm just going to plug it real quick here. It's called Fartoon, and the writer is Terry Isley. He wrote was it 3-part or three-volume set called With Only 5 Plums, which is brilliant. It's really great. It's actually set during the Holocaust. It's about the raising of Lidice, the Polish town. And he's a great writer, and it's really awesome. But, for some reason, it's now I'm the go-to guy for teenage family drama, which is totally cool because I really love doing it. But
what he hasn't said is he really, really wants to draw like an entire issue of apes fighting other apes.
Yeah, Planet of the Apes or, Conan the Barbarian would be my dream comic, or Flash Gordon, but somehow I've gotten into the teenage drama, which is also very cool. Like, I'm not disrespecting it. I really love drawing that, and that's my thing, and I'm really good at it, but, I would like to draw giant monsters at some point again.
And that title again of the book the other book you're working on?
It's going to be called Fartoon.
Fartoon.
Far, Fartune, like far away music.
Okay.
Which is a play on words because our main character's name is Fartoon, Fartun, which is a Somali name. And it kind of plays on that because the kids at school make fun of her name, but it's really, her mother talks about how, her music takes her away. It's really going to be an awesome book. And oddly enough, we're working the same way Dara and I work. I'm just getting a few scenes at a time. But I think it's going to be really good, especially here in Columbus. A lot of people don't realize we actually have the second largest Somali population in the country, next to Minneapolis. So, I think here in Columbus especially, it's going to be something that's going to generate some interest. We've been talking to Terry particularly has been doing some interviews at a local Somali community center, and I went there and did some sketches. And he actually teaches at a school where there's a large Somali population, so he's been kind of bouncing it off of some of his students to make sure it's really accurate. It's not based on any one of his students. Apparently, it's kind of inspired by several students. But it's really fun, and again, I really, when I draw, I really love to get into as much accuracy as possible. I really love researching that stuff and then drawing it. So that's been really kind of fun to do.
Well, Dara, in addition to working on this third volume of Persia Blues, do you have any other comics projects that either you're working on now or pretty darn soon?
Nothing big. I've actually scaled back a lot. I'm trying to concentrate just on finishing the third volume. One of the things that I've talked on and off about with Dark Horse, with Mike Richardson, was I did a couple of short autobiographical stories in Dark Horse Presents about, when I was younger and I lived in Iran. And I would like to write a few more and just collect them all. But it just comes down to having the time to do it. And unfortunately, with a full-time job and trying to get this book done, it's sort of backburnered. So yeah, for the most part right now, it's just Persia Blues.
Yeah. So both of you are juggling your art, your writing and your art, along with full-time jobs?
Yes.
Yeah, full-time jobs and families.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, now before we go, if our listeners wanted to find out more, not only about Persia Blues, but also you guys, do you have websites that you can point them to?
Yeah, probably the best one is PersiaBlues.com. And that has, we've got a whole bunch of, 20, 30 pages of previews from the books. And there's bios for both of us with links to our own personal website, so they can always go look more at Brent's artwork. And
yeah, that's the best way to find, because I have multiple websites. So
yeah, so that's sort of like the one-stop shop.
Okay. So, well, Dara and Brent, I want to thank you very much for being on the Comics Alternative, and I very much look forward to the third volume coming out.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
And there you have it, my conversation with Dara and Brent. I want to thank those guys for taking the time and being on the Comics Alternative. If you want to get a copy of Persia Blues, then you can head over to the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. In fact, if you go to dcbservice.com right now, you're going to find volume number 1 of Persia Blues for 30% off of the cover price. They do not yet have volume 2 listed, but if you go to our website, comicsalternative.com/Amazon, and use our associate link, you can find volume 2 at a great discount. And then after ordering those books, head on over to Just Coffee Co-op. It's a great place to get coffee, and if you use our coupon code at checkout, that's COMICS, you get 10% off of your order. And remember, shipping is free. And after you do get your books and your coffee, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading and what kind of coffee you're going to be drinking. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe, or you can call us over the phone. Our phone number is 415-3COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us on Twitter, as many of you do. We're at the number 2 guys with PhDs, and thanks to everyone who continues to retweet our tweets. You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, on Pinterest, and on YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, you can stream us on Stitcher, and you can also find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find all of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at the website, comicsalternative.com. I hope you enjoyed this interview. We have a lot more lined up for 2016, so be sure to check back later and see who we're talking to. Until then, take care.